I went on a winter hike in Michigan's northern peninsula with 3 friends during a school break, and we treated it like a casual afternoon walk, even though the temperature was already well below freezing. We chose a marked trail near a wooded area that locals used for snowshoeing, and we parked our car at a small lot that was nearly empty because most people had enough sense to stay home in that kind of cold. About an hour in, one of the guys spotted what he thought was a shortcut leading toward a frozen overlook, and he insisted it would reconnect with the main trail further ahead. I said we should stay where the markers were visible, but the others laughed it off and stepped into the untouched snow without checking a map or tracking our direction. At first, it felt manageable because the snow was packed tightly under the top layer, and we could still see the line of trees behind us. After 20 minutes of weaving between thick pines and uneven drifts, the trail markers disappeared completely, and the trees started to look identical from every angle. We tried to retrace our steps, but our footprints had already filled in from light wind and loose powder shifting across the ground. The temperature kept dropping as the sun lowered, and our breath started forming thick clouds that hung in the air longer than before. Our phones showed no service bars, and the batteries began draining quickly from the cold exposure. We kept walking in what we thought was a straight line, but the terrain dipped into shallow ravines and forced us to adjust direction again and again. One of the guys, Aaron, slipped on an icy patch hidden under snow and hit his knee hard enough that he couldn't put full weight on it afterward. We argued about whether to stay put or keep moving, and the debate wasted precious time while daylight faded behind the trees. Finally, they decided to split into 2 pairs to cover more ground. Even though every survival guide warns against dividing a group in freezing conditions, Aaron and I took the direction we believed led back toward the parking lot, and the other 2 headed slightly west, hoping to intersect the main trail. Within 15 minutes, the woods grew darker, and the temperature shift became more aggressive as the last light disappeared. I told Aaron we needed to keep a steady pace to maintain body heat, but his limp slowed us and forced frequent stops. We tried shouting the others' names a few times, but the sound was swallowed by the trees, and there was no response. Snow started falling harder, covering any sign of orientation and reducing visibility to a narrow tunnel in front of us. Aaron's jeans stiffened as moisture from melted snow refroze into the fabric, and the material turned rigid against his legs. He stumbled again, this time falling forward and staying down longer than before while his hands pressed into the ice. I grabbed his arm and forced him back to his feet, and we continued, moving even, though his steps became uneven and dragging. When we finally saw a faint orange glow in the distance, we assumed it was the parking lot lights reflecting off low clouds. I told him we were close and that we just needed to push through Another few minutes of walking. We started moving toward the light with everything we had left, ignoring the burning numbness in our fingers and toes. Then Aaron stopped responding when I called his name, and his body sagged forward as if someone had cut the strings, holding him upright. That's when I thought it was over. I had no idea what was about to happen next. The story isn't over. Subscribe the channel to continue. I shook him hard, and his head rolled slightly to the side. But he didn't answer, and his eyes stayed half open without focusing on anything. He tried to take a step when I pulled him, but his knees buckled, and he collapsed fully into the snow. I dragged him upright again and forced his arms over my shoulders, and I started moving toward the light that now seemed farther away than before. After several minutes of struggling through knee-deep drifts, I realized the glow wasn't a parking lot, but distant highway lights miles beyond the forest. I dragged him to the base of a tree to block some wind, and I rubbed his arms through the frozen denim that felt like solid boards. My fingers were losing sensation rapidly, and I had to look directly at them to make sure they were still gripping his coat. I forced him to stand again, and we took a few more steps together. But his boots scraped instead of lifting, and his head kept dropping forward. He kept saying he was tired, and that he just needed to sit for a minute, and his words were slow and slurred in a way I had never heard before. The lights in the distance flickered through branches as snow thickened between us and any possible exit. I yelled his name repeatedly and slapped his face lightly to keep him alert, but his responses became shorter each time. I left him propped against the tree for less than a minute, while I scanned the area for any sign of a clearing. And when I turned back, his body had slid sideways into the snow. The slope beneath him gave way slightly, and he rolled a short distance down into a shallow dip where wind collected heavier drifts. When I reached him again, his breathing was shallow and irregular, and his eyelids fluttered without opening fully. I drove my frozen hands under his shoulders and tried lifting him once more, but his weight felt doubled, and my legs were shaking uncontrollably. By the time I saw flashlight beams cutting through the trees, I was kneeling beside him and shouting for help with no strength left in my voice. A doctor later told his parents that prolonged exposure and rapid heat loss had pushed his body past recovery before we were found. They said another 30 minutes of movement earlier might have changed the outcome, but we had lost far more time than we realized when we left the trail and then split up. I sat in my car that night wrapped in emergency blankets while paramedics worked in silence, and I watched them stop trying after several long minutes. His parents hugged me at the hospital days later, and their hands were steady even though mine wouldn't stop shaking. I replay the moment we stepped off the marked path every single winter when the temperature drops below freezing. I was the one who argued against splitting up, but I still followed when they moved, and that decision is something I carry every day. Every winter storm warning on the news feels personal, and I see his frozen jeans and the way they cracked when I tried to bend his legs. I don't hike in snow anymore, and I never wear denim in cold weather because I know exactly how fast it turns against you. When people joke about horror movie characters making stupid choices, I remember that we did the same thing in real life and paid for it. I know exactly how quickly a normal afternoon can turn into a fatal chain of mistakes. And I know that one of us made it home while one of us never did. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.